How did the most industrialized, wealthy, democratic countries lose their lead in tanks? This volume is the first to combine the methods of history and science to resolve a controversy that has endured for a century. In both world wars, Western European, North American, and Australasian states were democratic, industrialized, and rich. They shared a dominant Western culture. They tended to ally with each other. Materially, their alliances overawed their enemies. Britain, France, and the United States acquired the first, largest, and best tank forces of the First World War. They ended victorious. They remained dominant despite peacetime turmoil. In tanks, the Western great powers remained innovative in the 1920s, but were misguided by the 1930s. Worse, they were overtaken by the very states they tried to contain. The Western great powers were practically the sole architects of peacetime international institutions, laws, norms, and rules. Their international regime was meant to contain the losers of the First World War: Germany, Austria, Hungary, the new states born of their empires, such as Czechoslovakia, and a revolutionary communist Russian empire, eventually named as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. These states were late developers. However, during the 1930s, the USSR and Germany, eventually incorporating Austria and Czechoslovakia, developed the largest tank forces, reverse-engineered Western tanks, and innovated for themselves. They achieved quantitative and qualitative superiority despite less capital and smaller automotive industries. By then, they were strong autocracies with a Central to Eastern European anti-Western orientation. In detail, Western tanks were curiously diverse and unbalanced. French, British, and US light and medium tanks prioritized speed. British infantry tanks and French heavy tanks prioritized survivability. Italy, one of the Western allies of the Great War, switched to tankettes as replacements for tanks after most other states realized tankettes as carriers and tractors. Japan, which also had sided with the West in the Great War, invested in heavy medium tanks before switching to lights. During the Second World War, the focus of Volume 2 in this series, Western states innovated but never caught up with Germany and the USSR. They developed more new base models and variants of old models than their enemies without satisfying user requirements. They ended the war qualitatively inferior in tanks and quantitatively inferior in units and formations, despite producing more types of tank. The Soviet Union produced the most tanks and boasted superior types than the next most productive country, the US. If the war had continued into 1946, German and Soviet tanks still would have been better developed than Western tanks. With Germany defeated, the Soviet Union maintained its lead into the Cold War. Western soldiers complained about their tanks, while propagandists pretended otherwise. Governments deferred official inquiry until after the emergency, then forgot their promises. Politicians spun the story to avoid blame or monopolize credit as convenient. Official historians ignored the record. Private historians lazily and nationalistically followed their respective official histories. Germany's defeat and hostility towards the Soviet bloc did not incentivize the West to admit its failings. Popular culture rightly celebrated ultimate victory and the West's superior naval and air forces, but not tanks. Realism about the failings of Western tanks declined from the mid-1990s, with the rise of revisionist fields and media. Television, the internet, and social media are often said to democratize knowledge, but really they popularize consensus. Almost everything said on tanks in the public domain relies on hearsay. One would hope for the experts to provide the virtues, but the academic and defense communities are producing fewer experts. The consensus is increasingly agenda-driven rather than evidence-based. Social scientists focus on the sociology, politics, and economics. Historians retell the personalities and battles. The technologies appear as a few qualitative judgments, such as weak, powerful, unreliable, and perhaps quantitative measures, such as gun caliber, armor thickness, and speed. Rarely are these data sourced or cited. Recent histories regress to the propaganda, politics, and nationalism of the time. Even the fact of the Western tank scandal has been denied. This book, The Rise and Fall of Western Tanks, is not about how tanks were used, how forces were structured, or how forces were employed, which are worthy topics for subsequent books. This series focuses on tanks as types. You will see the data and read the judgments direct from the developers and users themselves in real time. Most of these data and quotes were ignored by official historians and subsequently archived without reference to the tanks they describe. In these volumes, you will see more than 400 photographs and dozens of tables and graphs. You will see analysis of an unprecedented data set of tank attributes, providing quantitative evidence to counter the hearsay and comfortable myths. This dataset covers more than 500 tank types, up to 22 attributes per tank, over 40 years from 1916 to 1955, and 9 national producers: the US, Canada, Britain, France, Germany, Czechoslovakia, Italy, Russia and the Soviet Union, and Japan. This first volume follows the birth of tanks from the first tractors and imagined military vehicles in the 1850s through the first tanks of the First World War and the developments of the 1920s and 1930s up to the Second World War in 1939. The first chapter explains the technological foundations for tanks since the 1850s and why Britain was first to put them together. The second chapter explains the states that followed Britain in deploying tanks during the Great War. The third chapter shows that Western tanks were the best of those deployed by 1918 and reveals the neglected German designs that would have shocked the West if the war had continued into 1919. The fourth chapter reveals Britain's further inventiveness in the 1920s, but also its trend to lightweight until belated revival in the late 1930s. The fifth chapter tells of France's leadership in the 1920s before its proliferation of light tanks. The sixth chapter tells how America tried impressive technologies, but ultimately standardized only one medium tank before World War II, and no heavy tank before 1945. The seventh chapter explains Italy's and Japan's shared trend, under mostly Western influence, to light vehicles despite starting with medium to heavy requirements. The eighth chapter tells of Soviet and German collusion, their innovations, reverse engineering, and thefts, their rise from practically no tanks to the world's leading users, how the Soviet Union developed the best light, medium, and heavy tank series of the interbellum period, how Germany developed the longest produced platform of World War II, and how Czechoslovakia developed fine light tanks that ultimately benefited Germany most. The ninth and final chapter concludes with explanations and lessons from the whole period, from 1850 to 1939, from Europe to Asia to the Americas, from the Victorian age to World War II.